contrary to the view that we're, ruled by elected leaders, when it comes to matters of war and peace, it's the entrenched foreign policy bureaucracy that gets its way. Whatever the elected president wants, it's always undermined by the entrenched hawks in both countries. And Nuland bragged about this, that the U.S. had invested billions of dollars in promoting what she called Ukrainian civil society.
So recently, Aaron Matei went on Judge Napolitano's show to expose how the war in Ukraine actually began, why the Americans have been told a load of crap about the truth regarding this, and why it began about 8 or so years before they tell you on CNN. So let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
When the CIA and MI6 toppled President Yanukovych in 2014, why did the new government begin killing Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the eastern part of the country?
Well, because the people that propelled the coup that overthrew Yanukovych were ultranationalists. Recall that the Maidan, when it began in November 2013, this was the protest against Yanukovych because he delayed signing a trade deal with the EU. There wasn't a clear goal of regime change. It was mostly people upset that Yanukovych was, in their eyes, turning away from the West and aligning closer with Russia, when in reality it was actually more complex. Yanukovych had read the fine print of the deal that the European Union was putting before him, and the European Union was asking him to basically cut off people's pensions, cut off subsidies for energy, and basically make the cost of living higher for Yanukovych's constituency, especially in the east of the country, where it also was saying that you have to cut off ties to Russia. And Yanukovych recognized that for him this would be a political disaster. So he delayed signing that deal, which led to protests, which the U.S. and their allies then exploited by trying to push for regime change, and in the process siding with a small faction of hardline Maidan elements, people like the Svoboda Party, which were founded with neo-Nazi inspirations.
Yeah, Svoboda and Azov, the far-right nationalists, mostly from the western part of Ukraine, that was the faction that the U.S. decided to support when it poured money into Ukraine via U.S. aid. We know that U.S. aid gave them $5 billion in total. It's hard to know how much of that money went into the Maidan protests itself, but Yanukovych, had the sensible idea of wanting neutrality for his country, and that's what the U.S. deep state hates the most, is neutrality. That's not good enough. They wanted antagonism toward Russia, and that was the point of U.S. intervention in 2014 in Maidan. They call it the Revolution of Dignity. It was actually the revolution of stupidity and duplicity.
And so after the coup, which was pushed by elements like Svoboda, the ultranationalists got a lot of senior cabinet posts in the new government, and they took up their movement's top priorities, which included essentially wiping out Russian culture in the country. The first parliamentary act that was seriously taken up was to essentially ban Russia as an official state language. And in response to this, you had people in the East rising up in protest. And the ultranationalists, rather than trying to, broker a compromise, took this as an opportunity to escalate their attacks. And you had things happen like the Odessa massacre, which was in early May 2014, where dozens of people who were protesting the Maidan and calling for their rights as ethnic Russians, they were burned alive in a trade union building by a fascist mob.
Yeah, if you don't believe this, look up Odessa massacre in 2014. There's like 45 or 46 people, maybe even higher. It's about that number that were burned alive in this building. And not only were the culprits not convicted of crimes ever, they spit on these dead people, these poor people, and called them pro-Russian because they had the gall to object to their government being overthrown by the United States and this non-organic mob. And for that, they were put to death by fire, burned alive. It's just pathetic. It's horrendous. It's murderous. And we never got this story in the U.S.
So events like that helped galvanize this protest. And then you also had the CIA coming over. John Brennan slipped into Kyiv in mid-April. And according to a source that I spoke to who was there at the meeting, told his counterparts, who he had helped put in office, that you should launch an attack on the Donbass. You should forget about negotiation. You should, and we'll help you out. And lo and behold, 2 days later, that's exactly what the Ukrainian government did.
That's what they did. That started the conflict that a lot of people don't know, is that this war didn't begin in 2022, as MSNBC and CNN and Rachel Maddow told us. It began in 2014, immediately after the overthrow of the Yanukovych government. That's when Russia annexed Crimea. Crimeans voted by a plebiscite of 97% to be part of Ukraine. The oblasts in the Donbass voted in that accordance, and that caused a civil conflict with the U.S. supporting the Ukrainian side. And that was an 8-year war before Putin invaded, where the Donbass was shelled by the Ukrainian government, the illegitimate one that the U.S. helped install under Nuland. And that caused the deaths of more than 10,000 people, I believe. And that's what produced the Minsk Accords, which Ukraine violated, and that called for giving the Donbass political autonomy, much like Hong Kong had for 50 years. Right? That is what was violated, and that's the part of the story you never get.
Is there a meaning to the word, a meaning with significance to the word Maidan?
Well, Maidan is simply the square where the protest began.
Okay. And this is the event orchestrated in part, or at least promoted, by Victoria Nuland and her colleagues.
Absolutely. I mean, if you go back to that period, you look at the media outlets that were promoting the Maidan protest, promoting the coup. So many of them have ties to U.S. funding. In fact, there was one Ukrainian outlet that just spontaneously emerged right as the Maidan began, like out of nowhere. All of a sudden, there was a brand new Ukrainian outlet, and it was funded by the U.S. government. And Nuland bragged about this, that the U.S. had invested billions of dollars in promoting what she called Ukrainian civil society, which in real life means fronts for U.S. interests. Fronts that the U.S. can use to promote its regime change agenda, to the point where, after Zelensky got elected, he was elected on a mandate of peace. And in the first stages of his term, he did take some genuine steps towards trying to make peace and towards implementing the Minsk Accords, which was the European brokered pact endorsed by the UN Security Council to end the war that began with the Maidan.
Then he got incredible pressure from the far-right nationalist groups and Azov and the literal neo-Nazis within Ukraine. That is true. He was elected as somewhat of a peace broker, but that's not the road he went down, not only because of the pressure he faced internally from that lobby, but also the pressure from the US and the UK and the pro-NATO stooges that wanted to exacerbate tensions with Russia.
With the Maidan coup. And as Zelensky took steps, there was a really famous document put out by a group of so-called Ukrainian civil society members. It's a bunch of groups. And Ivan Kachinovsky, who was a Ukrainian-Canadian professor at University of Ottawa, he pointed out that if you look at the list of signatories, the vast majority are all funded by the U.S. and their allies. And what did this letter say, the statement say to Zelensky? Do not implement the Minsk Accords. That, recognizing that ethnic Russians in the East have legitimate grievances, that would be a red line for us. And allowing the Russian Orthodox Church to operate in Ukraine, that's a red line. So at every turn, the U.S., through its funded organizations in Ukraine, its proxies, promoted confrontation.
Yeah, that's right. Again, neutrality is the thing that the deep state hates the most. It wanted to push NATO's borders, into Ukraine, flirting with adding Ukraine to NATO, arming them with weapons. They wouldn't accept that if Russia did that in Canada and incorporated Canada into their military alliance, or even flirted with it after overthrowing the government in Canada. It wouldn't be acceptable. It shouldn't be a surprise that it was unacceptable to Russia, too. That's a reasonable ask, and you don't have to compliment Putin or the Russian government to say that. That's obvious.
All right, so President Obama leaves office and President Trump comes in, and Trump begins arming Zelensky's government to the teeth. Is there any articulable reason for that?
Well, the reason why Trump armed Ukraine was because of Russiagate. This was at the time when there was this all-consuming frenzy of allegations that Russia had waged a massive interference campaign to install Trump in office, and that Trump's campaign was possibly complicit. And it seems so funny to look back on now, but this was the dominant story of the first Trump years, and nobody challenged it in establishment media. Unfortunately, a lot of progressive media too. And so with that consensus solidified that Trump was the product of Russia and that he might even be a Russian conspirator, the hawks in Trump's White House took advantage of this, and to dispel the notion he was a Russian agent, encouraged him to authorize hawkish steps that Obama hadn't even taken, including arming Ukraine. And so many accounts have come out since. The New York Times recently reported that all while Trump's opponents were, just hyperventilating about him possibly being a Russian asset, U.S. intelligence officials thought this was great because it meant that this whole thing about Trump being a Russian asset was a good cover for Trump's administration to undertake hawkish policies against Russia and Ukraine, including building up, we learned from the New York Times, a number of secret bases and expanding their training and intelligence operations with Ukraine, basically.
Yeah, I think 12 bases in Ukraine, and I'm so glad Aaron is saying this, by the way. Again, this is something that a lot of people don't cover in relation to Ukraine and Russiagate, is that Russiagate had a dual purpose. It wasn't just the deep state effort to undermine Trump. It was also an effort to exacerbate tensions with Russia, believing that Trump's ego was big enough to call their bluff and take steps to escalate tensions with Russia, which he did. He unilaterally withdrew from the INF Treaty. That was a treaty between the U.S. and Russia that prohibited a certain class of ballistic missiles. He, lambasted them for giving Snowden asylum. He slapped new sanctions on them during that time, and he provided the first aid package, $400 million in offensive weapons. This was the Aegis missile system and the Javelin system, by the way. The Aegis missile system could be outfitted with ballistic missiles that you could put an H-bomb on. So that is what he did, and they succeeded. The deep state succeeded in exacerbating tensions with Russia,
turning Ukraine into even more of a CIA proxy. So Russiagate was the perfect storm because it encouraged Trump to escalate tensions with Russia, all while incentivizing the media and the political establishment to ignore what Trump was doing because they were so beholden to the conspiracy theory that he was actually doing the bidding of Vladimir Putin.
I mean, you can't make this up. The same deep state that was trying to ruin his presidency was encouraging him to arm the Ukrainians to wage the eventual proxy war against Putin.
Yeah, and this is when the intelligence, as Tulsi Gabbard just released in those unredacted documents and those declassified documents, that they knew the consensus was that Russia didn't interfere with the election and Trump didn't collaborate with Putin. It was all nonsense, but they doubled down on this to drive both angles, to undermine Trump and escalate tensions with Russia. The latter eventually worked. The first, consumed the media apparatus for 2 to 3 years. Ultimately, Trump triumphed in that one. He's president now, but they're still going to get away with it. It's not like this administration is going to even charge those clearly guilty of perjury like Comey and Brennan and Clapper. It's just so absurd.
That's right. And this is what so much of my forthcoming book is all about. It's about how, contrary to the view that we're, ruled by elected leaders, when it comes to matters of war and peace, it's the entrenched foreign policy bureaucracy that gets its way. And that's true as much about Trump as it is under Obama. Obama, if you read all the accounts, he didn't want to arm Ukraine. He was very worried about weapons, U.S. weapons going to neo-Nazis, and he was very worried that this would provoke Russia. And he also was worried that if we keep arming Ukraine, it's going to give Ukraine the false impression that they can win if we ultimately provoke Russia into invading. So Barack Obama foresaw all of this. But ultimately, if you look at the record of his administration, it didn't matter what he really thought because Victoria Nuland, as a senior State Department official, took it upon herself, along with others like Daniel Freed, who was serving in the State Department, to basically undermine Obama's own professed policy of giving the Minsk Accords a chance. And so Nuland encouraged an escalation. And finally, when Obama left office, the same foreign policy bureaucracy that Nuland was a part of took advantage of Russiagate to push Trump even more than Obama had been pushed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this was back in the days where mainstream legacy media in the United States actually did talk about the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, how that was a problem. They eventually covered this up when they wanted to fund Ukraine endlessly and said, oh, those are just a bunch of moderate Nazis. These were isolated incidents. That's not a problem anymore. Support the war effort endlessly. Push all of our money into Zelensky's pockets. But, Aaron's right, but I will add the caveat here that Obama did maintain an open door policy when it came to Ukraine and NATO. He flirted with that idea, not as vociferously and openly as George W. Bush did in the Bucharest summit when Bush said both Ukraine and Georgia will be part of NATO. That was very provocative. But Obama's hands aren't clean in this either. And obviously, he was, ultimately responsible for U.S. involvement in the Maidan coup, though Aaron is right, it was primarily Victoria Nuland and the State Department and USAID pumping money in to support that.
And that's why they got the weapons sent. That's why in Trump's first year, Congress also passed a measure solidifying Nuland's sanctions that she had designed and making it impossible for Trump to undo them. And Trump signed that bill. He signed it. He didn't want to, but he signed it because, under the storm of Trump-Russia allegations, he had no choice.
Yeah, he's like, I'll show them. I'm not pro-Russian. I'm going to stick it to Putin with these sanctions, which only damaged U.S. relations and U.S. trade and the trade that the citizens of Russia endeavored in. It never really hurts the government. It just gave Putin a propaganda tool against the West to say, hey, all of your economic woes are due to the West and due to the United States. But Aaron's exactly right. This is something Trump signed while they're trying to take him down as being a Russian agent. Eric Swalwell literally said he was a Russian agent, and that's much different than even being a Russian asset. Both were absurd, but that was the rhetoric going on at that time.
So there's a recurring theme here that no matter what the elected president wants, it's the hawkish, entrenched voices that have their say. And by the way, that's also true in Ukraine, because what happened in Ukraine after Zelensky was elected, the ultranationalist far right, which was very small numerically, but very large in power and the sway of the government, which had been empowered by the Maidan coup with the help of the U.S., they told Zelensky, forget it. Like, no matter what you want, it doesn't matter. And if you make peace with Russia, we'll kill you. Multiple people in Ukraine's far right threatened Zelensky's life. We've talked about a few of them before. And in fact, one more just came this week. The Times of London interviewed a guy named Sergei Sterneko of Right Sector. Okay. And this is what he said just recently. If Zelensky were to give any unconquered land away, he would be a corpse politically and then for real. It would be a bomb under our sovereignty. People would never accept it. And you can go back and see similar statements made to Zelensky right after he took office. Another member of Right Sector said that Zelensky will hang from a tree if he betrays the Maidan Revolution. So this is a recurring theme in both the U.S. and Ukraine. Whatever the elected president wants, it's always undermined by the entrenched hawks in both countries.
Man, isn't that the truth? That's the truth that's panned out when it comes to Ukraine for sure. Same with Israel and the United States, but Aaron is right. Zelensky faces those kind of pressures in addition to the pressures that he faces when it's the U.S. and Britain and NATO allies. It's the Starmers and Macrons and Marizes of the war, saying, fight on, we got your back. We don't have your front because you're all going to die, but we have your back. That's the dynamics at play here. And that's why I think Zelensky fears the right-wing forces within his own country far more than he fears Putin, because he could hang from a tree. The rhetoric is legitimate when it comes to these groups that are literal neo-Nazi groups. This is not just throwing out that term flippantly and associating it to whoever you don't like in the United States. These are actual neo-Nazis. And if you don't believe me, in addition to what Aaron talked about there, which were exact primary quotes, just search Andriy Beletsky. That is a neo-Nazi leader. A lot was written about him in the 2010s and about his, ultra-right nationalist views, his pro-Nazi views, completely abandoned those kind of articles after the U.S. was supposed to drop everything and support democracy in Ukraine. But I'm glad Aaron's telling the story in the real way. I can't wait to get his book on this. If he touches on the history in Ukraine, that'll be awesome. But Aaron has the right views when it comes to the deep state. No matter what the names are, the deep state remains the same. No matter the names, the deep state remains the same. They have the same impulses, the same incentives, and it's regime change operations, empire building, military strikes, threatening sanctions, all this nonsense that doesn't benefit Americans, especially when we're $37 trillion in debt, and the central bank is printing more currency to finance this madness. That's what they did under the COVID schemes, too, and the CARES Act, and that's what they did in the TARP bailouts. all of it depreciates the value of our money by expanding the money supply. It imposes a hidden tax. That hidden tax is inflation, and politicians get away with it because it doesn't even have to be legislated. They can keep the same, income tax brackets as they are and impose this hidden tax that Americans feel every time they go to the grocery store or fill up their cars or buy supplies or purchase healthcare or education, all of which are costs that are skyrocketing, and they skyrocket to the degree that the Fed prints more money. But that's where we're at. Let me know down below. Do you agree with Aaron Matei? Is there anything about the Maidan coup or the background of Ukraine you think is wrong? Please let me know down below. And do you think a peace will be secured in Ukraine anytime soon? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also subscribe to Andrew Napolitano. His podcast is awesome. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support the channel, and I'll really appreciate that. I'll even tip my hat to you. And in return, I will give you access to all of my videos that are members only before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.